Hello and welcome, I'm your Code Monkey. In this lecture, we're going to learn how to use Asserts. This is a very interesting code validation tool, and then we're also going to talk about unit testing in general. Okay, so Asserts. This is an interesting way to make your code much more robust and free from errors. It is really just a simple way to test for something. This way, we can easily validate our code to make sure everything works exactly as expected. For example, here is a player class, and on the constructor, we receive a string for the player name. Now let's say the name is never ever supposed to be null. Basically, the rest of our code is making the assumption that player name is never null. So we want to make sure that rule is enforced. Basically, if that happens, then it's an error in the code that should never happen. So we do want to know if it does happen. And one way to do that is with an assert. Now they exist inside the debug class. This one inside system.diagnostics. Inside we can call the assert function. And this one takes in a condition. We want to make sure this condition is true. So in this case, let's make sure the player name is not null. And yep, just like this, very simple. So now up here, if we construct a brand new player, if we do this and we pass in a valid name, so a proper name, if there it is works, nothing happens. Whereas if we pass in with null, if there it is, our code basically just stopped. Now importantly, this is not an actual error. The program did not crash, it is still running. Instead, it really just paused. So this assert really just acts like a breakpoint. That way we can use our debugger tools in order to figure out exactly what happened. And then if we want, we can click on continue to continue running the rest of the program. And if it continues, terminates, and so on. So basically, asserts help you ensure that certain conditions are true. If it is not true, the program will pause. Now, one extremely important thing is how asserts are meant for validating code only during development. This is not meant to be used during runtime. In fact, by default, this won't actually even run during the final build. It has to do with up here for the configuration manager for the various configurations. By default, this one, debug.assert, this will only run if you have the debug configuration selected. Now, I talked about these configurations a little bit more in the lecture on preprocessor directives. So like this, if we select debug, the assert will run, but if we change this to release, this is what you would normally do when making the final build of your game. If so, then even if you pass in the wrong data, if you pass in null over here, nothing would actually happen. If you don't have the debug configuration selected, then it's as if this line of code does not exist at all. It is completely not included in the compilation. So keep that in mind. The goal with assert is to ensure your code is behaving exactly as it should be during development, and then after you verify that everything works, then you make a release build. If you do want to make some verification logic during runtime, for example, in this case, let's say the player name was a user input instead of a hard-coded string by a programmer. If it was a user input, then you would not use this. If it was user input, you would make a simple if. So if player name equals null, then do something. So do remember that point. The goal with asserts is to validate your own code, and then you can use regular logic to validate runtime code. Now, if you do want to do asserts in runtime, there's actually a way. So over here, debug.assert, like I said, this line will not be included in the compilation if up here we have release selected, but we can use trace.assert, and this one does pretty much the exact same thing, but this one is included in release mode. In general, that's really all asserts are. You just have a simple condition. You add these in various places in your code to make sure your conditions are always true, to make sure the code is running correctly. And if something goes wrong, then you simply know about it so you can fix it. Now, since asserts are all about testing your own code and making sure that it behaves as intended, let me just briefly talk about code testing, or specifically unit testing. This is a huge topic, so I'm just going to briefly mention a high-level overview. So when doing unit testing, that is when you write a bunch of tests to ensure your code behaves exactly as expected. So for example, over here for this player class, let's assume the player should never be null, but then let's also say this one doesn't make that assumption, it just stores the player name. And then let's have some kind of function, so get player name length, and this one just goes inside the player name and returns the length. Now naturally, if over here the player name is null, then this one is going to throw an exception. So if this was our player class and we want to test this, then basically just come up with a bunch of tests, a bunch of edge cases where your code could go wrong. Like for example, up here, define a player class, player, set it to null, and then call player.getPlayerName length. You would put this whole thing in some kind of try catch. And if it throws an exception, then simply we have the test failed. And if not, then test succeeded. So yep, let's test. And yep, this one throws a null reference exception. And we can see indeed our test failed. So this is a basic example of a test. You set up everything to run the test, and then maybe it succeeds or maybe it fails. And if it fails, then you know you need to fix something. So you do that, you would fix that. Like for example, up here, you would add if this one equals null. If so, then set it to an empty string. And if now with that change, now the test does succeed. So this is really a very rough high-level overview of unit testing. You have a unit, meaning some piece of code. It can be an entire class or just a function. You have that, then you write some tests to test whatever you want. In this case, testing what happens if the player has a null name, and then we try getting the player name linked. So you write all your tests, and then if all the tests pass, then the code is good, and if something fails, then basically you have some work to do. Then in order to write these tests, technically you could do it all like this, build it all from scratch, but there's a bunch of testing frameworks that can help simplify that process. The official one by Microsoft is called MS Test. There's a pretty simple guide here on how to start using it. So basically you have some kind of code that you want to test, then you create some kind of test project, you create a class that is going to test a bunch of things. For example, it tests over here that number 1 should not be prime, so it makes some assertions, there's a bunch of things. And instead of having to write all that try-catch code that we just saw, it really just works based on adding a bunch of attributes. So using a testing framework like this can make it much easier to make some tests. Two other very popular testing frameworks for C# are, one of them is NUnit, and another one is called XUnit. So if you want to do unit testing, it is probably wise to use a proper testing framework. Alright, so that's Asserts. It's a way to validate your own code and test your own logic during development. This way you make sure your code is running exactly as intended before making the final build. And here we also covered a high-level overview of unit testing, what it is, and the various frameworks you can use.